Montana Territory, late spring of 1879. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth across the Bitterroot Valley, and Eleanor Merritt stood in the shadow of St. Paul's Chapel with her wedding veil clenched in her fists and her heart crumbling like old stone. She had been promised to Thomas Callahan since they were children. He had written her every month from his uncle's ranch near Helena after moving west 2 years ago, and she'd followed him here with nothing but a satchel, dreams, and a dress her mother had stitched before passing. But now Thomas stood at the altar with another woman, Clara Hartley, daughter of a wealthy cattle baron, and Eleanor was left staring at the wooden doors that had shut her out of her own wedding. "You cannot be here," Mrs. Hartley had hissed when Eleanor arrived. Thomas made his choice, and he had. Clara with her gold necklace and lace gloves. Eleanor had not even been granted a word. She did not cry. She would not. Instead, she stepped off the chapel steps and kept walking until boots crunched behind her in the gravel. She turned sharply, expecting mockery or scorn. It was the cowboy from the Callahan ranch, the quiet one. "Miss Merritt," he said gently, removing his hat. "You do not have to leave," she blinked at him. "I have nowhere else to go." His hand twitched like he wanted to reach for her, but he kept it to his side. "My name is Elias Morgan. I work cattle for Thomas's uncle. I saw what happened. That was wrong." She did not answer. The cold air bit through the lace sleeves of her dress. Her fingers trembled. Elias cleared his throat. "There's a bunkhouse on the ranch not being used. Warm stove, clean water. You can stay there tonight. Just tonight, if that's all you want." "I am not a stray," she said, chin high. "I know that." His voice was calm. "But I reckon you are hurting, and no one should be alone right now." She hesitated, then nodded once. He led her to his horse, a dappled gray with a gentle gait. He rode silent beside her as they followed the trail out of town, past where the hills rolled green and far, and the last snow clung to the mountain crests. The ranch lay quiet in the dusk. No sign of Thomas. Elias dismounted and helped her down without touching her more than he had to. His hands were warm, steady. He lit a lantern and opened the bunkhouse door for her. "Clean linens," he said. "There's stew in the pot if you're hungry." She stepped inside. The room was small but neat. A single bed, a stove, a basin. She turned back toward him. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at the floorboards. "Because someone should." She watched him for a long moment. Then she said, "Thank you." He nodded and left her there alone. That night, Eleanor lay beneath the wool blanket staring at the ceiling. Her heart still ached, but the quiet of the bunkhouse wrapped around her like a second skin. The stove crackled low. She thought of Thomas's face as he turned from her. He had not even flinched. She did not cry, but she did not sleep either. The next morning, Elias came with coffee and biscuits. He knocked once and waited for her to let him in. "I will find somewhere else today," she said, brushing her hair back with her fingers. "No rush," he said. "You are welcome here." She studied him. He was not handsome in the polished way Thomas had been, but he was strong and sun-browned, with eyes the blue of glacier lakes and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked. He poured her coffee. "Because you deserve better than what you got." 3 days passed. Eleanor helped in the kitchen, mended shirts, even rubbed liniment into the shoulders of a bay gelding with a limp. She did not ask about Thomas, and Elias never mentioned him. They worked in companionable quiet. When she laughed once, just once, at a story Elias told about a stubborn calf, he looked startled, then pleased. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from her brother in Kansas. Their father's debts had caught up with them. There would be no help from home. No return. Eleanor sat on the bunkhouse steps staring at the folded paper. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting the barn in gold. Elias approached, wiping his hands on a rag. "Bad news. I have nowhere to go," she said softly. He nodded. "Then stay." She looked at him. "Why?" His jaw tightened. "Because you could make this place better, and I would like it if you stayed." She stood slowly. "You do not pity me?" "No," he said. "I admire you." For a long moment the wind moved between them. Then she said, "All right, I will stay." She cooked supper that night. Elias sat across from her at the narrow table, watching her hands move as she stirred the pot. His eyes met hers when she passed him bread. "You cook like someone who has not had much kindness," he said. She swallowed. "I suppose I have not." He reached over and gently, carefully, brushed a curl from her cheek. "Then maybe you deserve some now." Her breath caught. Later, when she went to sleep, she pulled the blanket close and smiled for the first time in days. The next morning, she found a sprig of mountain lupine on the table, blue as his eyes. She carried it with her all day. By the end of June, the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out fully, casting dappled shade across the pastures. Eleanor had taken to rising early, lacing her boots before the sky turned pale, and walking the fence-line with a tin cup of coffee cooling in her hand. The bunkhouse no longer felt borrowed. Her days had shape now, milking in the morning, mending afternoon, and helping Elias with the gentler horses when he asked. She found herself watching how he moved around animals, quiet, unhurried, never raising his voice. Even the skittish dun gelding that had thrown a stable hand last spring followed him like a hound. He never called attention to it, never looked to see if she was watching, but she always was. One morning, after she'd scrubbed the last of the kitchen pans and hung a towel to dry over the pump handle, she found Elias in the north paddock, coiling a lasso. "Did you ever plan to stay here?" she asked, folding her arms along the fence rail. He glanced over. "I meant to leave last winter." "What stopped you?" He looped the rope over his saddle horn and leaned against the gatepost. "There was a boy, barely 12. Took a fall trying to break a colt too early. I couldn't leave him with no one to teach him better." She considered that. "Is he still here?" Moved on. "But by then the herd was short-handed and I figured I'd stay through spring." He looked at her then, eyes steady. Then spring turned into now. She stepped down into the paddock, careful of her hem. "Do you want to leave still?" He didn't answer right away. "I don't think about leaving much anymore." She lowered her gaze, brushing dust from the edge of her apron. "I never meant to stay in Montana, not like this." "I know." "I wrote to a woman in Missoula," she said. "She runs a boarding house. Said she might have need of a cook." His jaw tensed, but he didn't look away. "Would you go?" "I don't know." She met his eyes. "I don't want to run from things anymore." Elias stepped closer, resting one hand on the fence post between them. "Then don't." She searched his face. "What would I be staying for?" He didn't touch her, didn't reach. "You'd be staying because you wanted to. That's reason enough." Later that afternoon, she found a carved wooden comb left by the bunkhouse door. It had no note, but the edge was smoothed from hours of sanding. She ran her thumb along it, then tucked it into her pocket without saying a word. A week passed. The cattle were moved up to summer pasture, and Elias returned late each evening, his shirt damp with sweat and the sun making his skin darker than before. Eleanor began using the cook fire out near the barn so she could see when he rode in. One evening, she was stirring cornmeal over the flames when he walked up behind her, his hat in his hands. "Did you make that stew again?" he asked. She nodded. "With dried sage from the hill slope." He smiled, slow and warm. "You're getting to know this land." She passed him a tin plate. "I'm trying." They sat on the split log near the fire, the dusk painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold. The cicadas had begun their song, and the air smelled of dust and new grass. Elias broke a piece of bread in half and handed it to her. "You seem steadier now." "I am." She looked into the fire. "I don't think about him anymore, not with hurt." "I'm glad." She turned toward him. "Are you always this patient with people?" His brow furrowed slightly. "Not with everyone." "Why with me?" He was quiet, then said, "Because I saw how you stood outside that chapel, like someone who'd been broken more than once and was done pretending it didn't matter." Her breath caught at that. She looked away, then back. "Maybe I was. I knew if I said the wrong thing you'd bolt, and I didn't want that." "Why?" He didn't hesitate. "Because I wanted to know what you'd be like when you weren't carrying the weight of someone else's choices." She looked down at her hands. "And what am I like now?" Elias gave her a long, quiet look. "Like someone who belongs." She leaned her shoulder against his. "I think I might." They didn't speak again that evening. When he walked her to the bunkhouse, he didn't reach for her hand, but his presence beside her felt like something settled. She left the door ajar until he'd reached the barn, then closed it softly behind her. She slept with the comb under her pillow. By mid-July, the hills had turned dry and sweet-smelling, and the heat rippled above the earth in long, wavering lines. Eleanor rose before the sun now not from habit, but from a quiet hunger for the rhythm of this place. She had started turning the soil in a small patch behind the bunkhouse, coaxing beans and squash from the warm ground with a patience that surprised her. She had not spoken of leaving since the letter from Miss Ola arrived 2 weeks prior. The paper stayed folded at the bottom of her trunk, untouched. That morning Elias approached as she knelt among the chutes, brushing dirt from his hands. "Found wagon tracks down past the southern ridge," he said. "Didn't look like any of ours." She straightened, shading her eyes. "Drifters? Could be, or someone looking to settle." He paused, then added, "You ever think about building something more permanent here? A home, maybe." She brushed soil from her palms and stood. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "You already have," he said. "You just haven't called it that yet." She didn't answer, but the words stayed with her long after he walked back toward the barn. That evening, she used the last of the molasses to bake cornbread, and when Elias sat down beside her to eat, she reached for his hand without thinking. He froze, surprised, then let his fingers curl around hers. "I've been thinking about something," she said, her voice low. "All right. I want to learn how to ride like you do," he blinked. "You've ridden before, not like you, not with intention. I want to know how to move cattle without losing control of the reins. I want to be useful out there." "Why?" She looked at him. "Because I want to belong to this place, not just live in it." Elias nodded slowly. "Then I'll teach you. But you'll be sore for a week." "I'm already sore every day," she said, and he gave a quiet laugh. The next morning he brought out a chestnut mare with a mild disposition and a low gait. "Her name's Bramble. She don't spook easy." Eleanor mounted with effort, adjusting her weight. Elias adjusted the stirrup and stepped back, arms crossed. "Keep your heels down. Let her feel your weight through the saddle, not your hands." They rode out toward the flats, where the land opened into a quilt of dry grass and scrub. He showed her how to guide with knees, how to read the twitch of the horse's shoulder before she shifted. She listened, concentrating hard, her jaw tight from the effort of learning something new with a man she wanted to impress. When they stopped to water the horses by a trickle of stream, she dismounted and stretched her back. "Harder than it looks," she muttered. "You're doing better than most men I've trained." She glanced over. "You train a lot of women," he smiled faintly. "Just one." They rode back in silence. At the barn, he reached for her reins, but she held on. "I'll do it," she said. "If I'm learning, I should learn the end of it too." He stepped back, nodded once, and watched as she untacked Bramble and brushed her down, slow and steady. The sun dipped low, and cicadas filled the spaces between words neither of them said. That night, she sat on the bunkhouse steps with her sewing in her lap, though the light was too poor to see the stitches. Elias walked up carrying a small parcel wrapped in brown cloth. "Was at the post this morning," he said. "Something came for you." She took it, heart suddenly uneasy. The paper bore familiar handwriting, careful and narrow. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a faded photograph of her and Thomas as children, standing beside a creek in Kansas. Below it, a note, unsigned. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it once, twice, and stood. "Burn it for me," she asked, handing it to Elias. He didn't ask questions. He stepped to the fire pit, struck a match, and let the flame do its work. She didn't watch it burn. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her. "Are you all right?" "I am now." She reached for his hand again, this time not tentative. He met her grip with his own, rough and warm. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began. "About riding?" "No, about building something." He waited. "I don't want to do it alone," she said. His thumb brushed over her knuckles. "You won't have to." The wind rustled the tall grass in the dark, and somewhere near the barn, an owl called once and fell silent. That night when she lay down, she didn't draw the blanket up tight. The air no longer felt lonely. August brought a dry heat that settled into the bones of the land, drawing cracks in the earth and turning the grass along the hillsides brittle and yellow. The air carried the scent of dust and pine pitch, and the cattle moved slower now, tongues lolling as they followed the trickle of water that still ran through the East Creek bed. Eleanor had taken to riding Bramble every morning before the sun climbed too high. She rode with more ease now, her posture steady, her hands firm but responsive. Elias trailed beside her on a tall sorrel gelding, quiet as always, though his eyes followed her with a kind of quiet pride. They rode north that morning, toward the ridge where the old line cabin sat half-fallen, its roof sagging near the chimney. Elias dismounted first and tied his reins to a low limb. "Cabin's been empty since before I came," he said, brushing flies from the horse's neck. "Used to belong to one of the first hands. He built it for his wife, but she died of fever before she ever saw it." Eleanor stepped inside, the boards creaking under her boots. The place smelled of dry wood and ash. A rusted kettle sat on the hearth, thick with dust. "It could be mended," she said, brushing her hand across a windowsill. "New roof, stones repacked," Elias leaned against the doorframe. "Would take time." "Time's something we have," she answered, then turned toward him, brushing her hair from her brow. "If you'd help me, I'd like to fix it." "Make it mine," he nodded without hesitation. "We'll start tomorrow." Outside, the sun had crested the peak, and the wind stirred the tall grass in waves. As they rode back, Eleanor felt something settle in her, not comfort exactly, but a kind of decision. She didn't speak it aloud, but Elias rode closer, as if he already knew. That evening, Eleanor brought out the ledger that had belonged to the ranch's first cook. Its pages were brittle, but still legible. She penciled in her own notes on how long the beans took to soften, how much lye was needed to render soap, how many hours a saddle blanket should hang before it was dry enough to use. The handwriting was careful. Elias came in as she finished, carrying a narrow plank of wood and a small tin of nails. Found it in the barn loft. Was part of a wagon bed, I think, strong enough for a step or a shelf. She looked up from the ledger. "You think about things before you speak, don't you?" "Most times," he said, setting the board against the wall. "Why?" "Because I've come to trust what you say." He crouched beside her, elbows on his knees. "That trust means something to me." She reached for his hand, not with hesitation now, but with quiet certainty. He let his fingers wrap around hers. "Elias," she said, voice low, "I don't want to be alone anymore." "Not in the ways that matter." He didn't answer immediately, but he turned his hand so their palms met fully. Then he said, "You won't be." The next morning they rode out early. They brought a small hammer, nails, a borrowed saw, and a rolled oilcloth packed with jerky and biscuits. The ride to the cabin took the better part of an hour, and by the time they arrived, the sun had begun to climb hard and unforgiving. They worked side by side, pulling down rotted roof slats, stacking stones for the hearth, scraping moss from the sill so she could see out the window again. They did not speak much, but the silence felt companionable, like the way trees stand near one another without needing to touch in the afternoon. Eleanor stood beside the hearth, her hands black with soot. "If we can mend the roof before the first frost, I can start curing meat here," she said. "Store flour and dried apples, maybe even keep chickens." "You thinking of staying through winter then?" She looked over her shoulder. "I'm thinking of never leaving." Elias set down the hammer and crossed the room. He stopped just short of her, close enough she could see the line of dust across his collarbone. "I want that too," he said, "but not if you're choosing it just because this place is easy." "This place isn't easy," she said, "but you are honest and steady." "And I've never known that before." He rested his forehead against hers, just the barest touch. "Then I reckon we've both found something worth holding on to." That night, they didn't return to the main ranch. They slept side by side on a bed of blankets in the unfinished cabin, the roof still half open to the stars. The air was warm, the night quiet. Eleanor lay with her head against Elias's shoulder, listening to the steady rhythm of his breath. I used to think I had to wait for someone to choose me, she said softly. You were waiting on the wrong man, Elias murmured. She reached up and touched his cheek. I'm not waiting anymore. And in the hush between words, with old wood beneath them and the sky stretched wide above, they both understood that something had begun, not sudden, not rushed, but certain. Come morning, they would ride back for more supplies. But tonight, they had everything they needed. The first frost came early that year, clinging to the thistle heads like spun glass and edging the cabin window panes in fine lace. The roof had been patched in time, and Eleanor had packed dried turnip and salt pork into sacks along the cabin's back wall. The hearth burned slow and steady, and the light glowed gold across the pine plank floor Elias had laid with his own hands. She stood at the stove, stirring a pot with the last of the barley, when he came in carrying a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. His coat was dusted with frost, his hair damp at the temples. Traded with a trapper passing through, he said, setting the bundle down. Got beeswax, good flint, and a bolt of muslin. She wiped her hands on her apron. That'll stretch the linens come spring. He set a small tin beside the cloth. And this for you. She opened it slowly. Inside lay a brooch, small and oval, carved from bone. A blue jay feather had been pressed beneath the finish, delicate and bright even under the dull tin lid. I saw you watching them, Elias said, out by the creek. You said they reminded you of movement. She touched the edge of the brooch, her voice soft. I never had anything like this. I wanted you to have something of your own, no one else's choosing. She looked up at him. You have a way of knowing what matters without needing to be told. He stepped closer, the air between them warming with the fire. You've made this place into something I didn't know I needed. I'm not afraid anymore, she said, not of being forgotten. Not of being left behind. He took her hand, pressing her fingers to his chest. You never will be. The wind shifted outside, rattling the shutters. Elias moved to close the latch, but Eleanor stayed him with a touch. Let it blow, she said. We're warm enough. They spent the evening finishing the quilt she had pieced together from worn shirts and feed sacks. She stitched, while he read aloud from a book he'd found in the bottom of an old trunk, essays on soil and crop rotation, meant for settlers who had more hope than experience. His voice was rough but careful, and she listened not for the content but the cadence of him beside her, the way his presence folded into hers without effort. As the fire burned low, Elias stood and crossed to the hearth. He took a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and turned it over in his hands. I sent a letter to my sister in Fort Benton, he said. Told her I wouldn't be coming back east. Eleanor set her needle aside. You had family there, only her. She's married to a riverboat captain. I used to think I'd go back, maybe help them with their boys, but I wrote to say I've found my place, that I built a home with someone I'd walk through any winter for. Her throat tightened. You didn't tell me. I wanted to show you first, not in words. In days. He knelt beside her then and took both her hands in his. I want to marry you, Eleanor, not for show or name or duty, but because there's not a morning I want to wake without you beside me. Her voice caught, but she didn't cry. She smiled, slow and full. Yes, she said. I want that too. They married 3 days later, just the two of them and the mountains behind. A traveling preacher passed through on his way north and stood with them beneath the bare-limbed cottonwoods. Eleanor wore a dress she had mended from what she'd brought west, and Elias wore his cleanest shirt, the sleeves patched from long use. They spoke their vows without flourish, but their voices rang steady. After, they shared coffee and bread inside the cabin, and Eleanor tucked the brooch into a box lined with muslin for safekeeping. Winter settled fully soon after. Snow came in slow drifts, and the world shrank to the rhythm of firewood, stew pots, and the hush of wind against the eaves. They read by lamplight, played cribbage on a board Elias carved himself, and learned the shape of one another's silences. Eleanor planted corn and onion in the spring. Her hands were stronger now, her back used to bending. Elias built a shed for the chickens and fitted a second window into the cabin's south wall to catch the morning sun. She laughed more now, not with surprise but with ease. He sang sometimes while chopping wood, low and tuneless, and she never teased him for it. They never spoke of what had come before, not out of fear, but because they no longer needed to. The past had settled into the soil, part of the land that grew their life. In September, Eleanor sat on the step of their cabin, her hands resting over the small curve of her belly. Elias came up from the field, his shirt damp with effort, and she smiled as he drew near. "You're going to be a father," she said, her voice clear and certain. He knelt in front of her, resting his forehead gently against hers. "I'll do right by both of you," he whispered, and he did. They stayed in the Bitterroot Valley, year after year, through frost and thaw, through drought and bloom. The cabin grew a second room, a root cellar, a porch where their child would one day walk, barefoot and laughing. Eleanor never left again. Not because she couldn't, but because she had finally found the place where her name was spoken with care, where her hands built something lasting, and where love wasn't a promise made and broken, but a life lived every day beside the man who saw her completely. And when the wind came down from the mountains, sharp and wild, it only made the fire inside burn brighter.